Good morning, church. So my name is Josh, if you've not met me before, and I've got the pleasure of bringing you the word today. Thanks. We finished the Sermon on the Mount series a few weeks ago, and Jesus finished that sermon with three "what choice are you going to make?" questions. He says, will you take the wide or the narrow road? Do you produce good or bad fruit? And are you building on sand or solid rock? And this question about building is a question I've been thinking about for most of the last 2 years, because since my wife and I got married, we've been looking into the question of how do we build a life together. And some of you will be quite familiar with the physical side of that in terms of actually finding a place to live in. But more importantly, I've been thinking about how do I build a house where God is glorified? How do I find a place where our faith shines? And how do we ensure that our lives and our homes and our relationships are a place where God is present? So what I've decided to talk about today is a few specific stories in the Bible about building and what we can learn from these stories about how we build a house of God. So we're going to start by looking at the first physical construction built in the Bible. And we don't have to look very far. It's the city built by Cain in Genesis chapter 4. And I'll quickly recap the Bible up until this point. In Genesis 1, God creates the heavens and the earth, and he puts mankind in it, and he says to go forth and fill the earth. In Genesis 2, God creates a helper. He realized that it's not good for man to be alone, and he says, I will make for him a suitable helper. That's Genesis 2:18. In Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve sin against God, and as a result, they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden. But God clothes them. It says, and the Lord God made garments of skin and clothed them. That's Genesis 3:21. Then in Genesis 4, Cain gets jealous of his brother Abel, and he goes out and he kills him. And the Lord God sends Cain further away, but Cain is worried, and so God gives him a sign to protect him. We read in Genesis 4:15, the Lord placed a mark on Cain that no one found who finds him would kill him. And it's at this point, Cain then goes out and builds a city. And we quickly see in Genesis 4 that this is not a good city. In just a few verses later, we're introduced to Lamech, who takes for himself 2 wives, not the one helper that we had in Genesis 2, but 2 wives. He also sings a song bragging about a murder he committed, promising God's vengeance 10 times over on anyone who opposes him. So what went wrong? What made this city such a city of violence? The problem here is that Cain's building of the city symbolized a rejection of God's plan. Rather than being satisfied with what God had given them, the helper and the clothing that we see there in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, they wanted more, and then they wanted to build walls to protect what they were taking. The main property of an ancient city was its walls. They were taking things and they were trying to protect them. The author of Genesis has emphasized this with their words. I've written the Hebrew words for helper and clothes and city on the far side of that slide, and you can see how similar they are. The author is trying to tell us that Cain is taking what God is given and replacing it with something that he thinks is better. So the first conclusion that I've come to is don't build to replace God. Are you building wealth or possessions or relationships to replace God? Does your security come from God, or does it come from elsewhere? Do you trust in God's provision? Because sometimes we're focused on building walls and protecting ourselves, but Jesus too, he sends out people just with each other and just with the clothes they have, similar to Genesis. We read in Mark chapter 6, verses 7 to 9. Jesus called the 12 to him and began to send them out 2 by 2, giving them authority over unclean spirits. He instructed them to take nothing but a staff for the journey, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, and to wear sandals, but not a second tunic. And this can be really hard. Those same disciples, they went into cities unprotected around the world, and the world did some awful things to all of them. We follow a God who walked into Jerusalem and was crucified simply because he rated his own protection. Jesus rated his own, he rated his life and his protection below his desire to see God's will in the world. And these examples are extreme. Cain's example of the city is extreme. Most of us don't build cities, but in our day-to-day lives, and if we read in the Bible, in just after Cain, the day-to-day lives of the patriarchs, we see them spending most of their time trying to build up their own house. Jacob, for example, spends most of his time building up his family, building up his wealth, building up his children and his possessions, but that doesn't protect him from the famine that comes at the end of Genesis. And so we then read in Exodus that God's representative people, Jacob's descendants, the Israelites, find themselves in Egypt, still building, but for someone else, for Pharaoh. They find themselves as slaves. And so what we see here is that building for yourself just leads to slavery to the world. If you're building for the sake of money or prestige or self-satisfaction, you'll find that you never have enough. You'll always be enslaved to the world, always be enslaved to the people around you. You'll find yourself wishing after what someone else has. In Genesis, it's a colorful coat, for example. Now, at this stage, you're probably wondering, Josh, is there an example of people building well? Because we haven't really got to that yet. But the answer is yes. In fact, just after God rescues the Israelites from slavery, he starts giving them instructions to build. They're in the middle of the desert, and they start to build again. But God tells them exactly what to do. He gives them very, very explicit instructions in Exodus about the tabernacle. He gives them very explicit instructions about the priestly garments, about the decorations, about the new temple they're going to have. He starts telling them exactly what to do. And he does this, and the way he does it ensures that everything points back to him. Everything points back to God. I have on the slide there an example of the blueprints of the tabernacle and temple, and that mirrors the dimensions and the design of the tree of life inside the garden inside Eden. God gives 7 speeches in Exodus, and you can mirror those to the 7-day creation story. I mentioned a minute ago that he gives very detailed instructions about the clothing of the priests, and you can map that to the fact that in Genesis, I mentioned earlier, God clothes Adam and Eve and covers their shame, and he's doing the same thing with the priest's clothing. We also read in Exodus about there's mirrors to the Noah's Ark story, which is another example of giving very explicit instructions for building and about God building in a way that saves people. So this leads me to my third point, which is we should build things that point to God. Now, I don't know about you, but whilst I'm very sure that God has led me to the place that I'm living now, I've got no divine decoration tips. God hasn't told me where to put my furniture or what to buy and what to put anywhere. But that doesn't mean I can't fill my house, fill my life with things that point to him. For example, I like to have plants in my house because they remind me of life, and life points to God. I like to put Bible verses in my house. Here are 2 examples. These are examples I have on display currently that were gifted to me by the Cattells and the Jobbins respectively, and they are on display in my house. I like to fill my house with things that point to God. But those are physical things. It's also a good idea to use just relational things or habits. You can build habits that point to God, such as your daily Bible reading. That's something that points to God. Your listening, anything you do that shows that God is in your life. Now, if this is you and you feel you're starting to build or you're looking to build God more into your life, or you have already built some habits that point to God, you may already have a daily Bible reading, a daily podcast listen, or a daily prayer time with God. You may be wondering, okay, I've built these into my life, or I'm going to try and build these into my life, but how do I protect them? How do I ensure that these things that I'm building into my life will actually be a success? So let's jump back to the Israelites. They eventually build the temple many years later. And when they finish it during the reign of Solomon, God doesn't tell them that he's going to protect the temple because of how grand it is. He doesn't say he's going to protect it and keep it safe because it's a marvelous temple, nor does he even say because they worked really hard on it. He doesn't even say he's going to protect it because it's where he lives. He says he'll protect the temple if the Israelites follow his decrees. We read in 1 Kings chapter 9, but indeed if you or your sons turn away from following me and do not keep the commandments and statutes I have set before you, and if you go off to serve and worship other gods, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and I will banish from my presence this temple I have sanctified for my name. Then Israel will become an object of scorn and ridicule among all peoples. This brings us to my fourth point, which is we need to build daily habits for God that keep our relationship with God solid. God is much more interested in us living out justice, in us listening to him, in us following his mercy, than in the things we build for him. We are reminded of this so many times through the Old Testament prophets. I've got 5 examples that are on the next slide, but there are many, many others. These are very justice-focused ones, but you can find them on mercy. You can find them on simply walking and spending time with God. So God is not as interested in the things that we build as he is in us simply following him. But in the case of the Israelites and their temple, really like we do as well, they fall short. They fail to maintain justice in the world. They fail to maintain right relationships with God, and they end up in exile. Their houses are destroyed, their cities are destroyed, the temple is destroyed, and their families are killed and ripped apart. It's an awful, awful time for them. And they end up in a foreign land away from where they live. But God does something really interesting at this point. It's at this point when they're at their lowest, they have failed to maintain the relationship, they have been banished from his presence, that he says to them through the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 29:5. He says to them, build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat their produce. It's when they're at their lowest, next slide please, Emily. It's when they're at their lowest that God tells them to build themselves back up. However, as we pause on this, he also tells them only a couple of verses later that in 70 years, they're going back. They'll be back in that promised land. They'll be back where they're supposed to be, back in the land he gave them. I wasn't there when the Israelites returned to the promised land. I wasn't there to see what it was like, but I don't imagine that any of them carried their houses on their back. I don't imagine that they stood there dragging trees from exile back to the promised land. Can we grab the next slide, Emily? It didn't really look like this. They would have had to leave those things they built behind. They can't take them with them. So that's our next point. Hold what you build loosely. If you're building things for yourself, building to build back up as the Israelites were doing in the exile land, that's fine. But you never know what you'll be required to leave behind. We read in Genesis 12 that God said to Abraham he had to go from his country, his people, and his father's household to the land that God would show him. So this is not the only time in the exile that God commanded them to leave and go back somewhere. Similarly, when somebody speaks to Jesus in the New Testament about following him, Jesus says, "Foxes have holes and the birds of the heavens have nests, but the Son of Man does not have a place where he may lay his head." God sometimes requires us to leave things behind, and you never know what that's going to be. So whatever you're building into your life, whether it's for God or for yourself, hold it loosely. Now, when the exiles do return, Zerubbabel leads the building of the temple. Ezra returns to build the knowledge of the Torah, and Nehemiah returns to build the walls. The people end up back in their city, but things are really no better. They build the second temple, but God's presence doesn't enter it like it entered the first temple. There's no great cloud of fire. The people are still there, but they're not following the laws. There's still no justice. There's still people being kept out. We read in the prophets, Zechariah, a contemporary prophet at that time, says Jerusalem will be a city without walls, but we've got Nehemiah saying, let's build walls. We're really passionate about building walls. We have Isaiah before saying that the house of the Lord will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but in Ezra and Nehemiah we read that the people are still being excluded unless they are a very pure Israelite. Things are still not going well. The prophets are not being listened to, and the people are still not following the law. Something's missing. So at this point, we come, as we always should, to Jesus. In Psalm 118, Jesus is described as the cornerstone. This word could be translated as cornerstone, which means the first stone of a building, the thing you build everything else on top of. But it can also be translated as capstone, which is the last stone, the stone that holds everything in place. And it has a really nice symmetry to it. Jesus is the first stone, and Jesus is the last stone, the Alpha and the Omega. And Jesus quotes this psalm about himself to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 21. He says to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures?" Next slide, please, Emily. "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit." Jesus here is challenging the Pharisees. Just before this quote, he gives the parable of the wicked tenants. In that parable, a man leases his vineyard, and at harvest time, he sends his servants to collect his share of the harvest from the people who are leasing it. And those people leasing the vineyard instead beat the servants and send them away. So finally, the owner of the vineyard sends his son to collect the harvest. But the tenants, they instead kill the son and try and claim the vineyard as their own. You see, the Pharisees, they wanted to build God's kingdom, but they didn't want Jesus. Don't reject Jesus in your efforts to build. And Jesus here in Matthew 21, he jumps from the building metaphor to the growth metaphor. Because Jesus cares a lot more about the fruit you produce than your efforts in building. He wants you to be connected to his vine so that you can produce that fruit. The natural outpouring of our faith is the important thing. So this brings me to my second last point. We need to work on building our relationship with God. We shouldn't be sitting here thinking of all the things we need to build into our lives, whether we need to build the daily Bible reading, the daily prayer, if we need to do more of those things, more podcasts, more inputs, more sharing with other people. We need to think about our relationship with God. God doesn't build his kingdom in people doing things for him. He builds it on the personal relationship with each and every one of us. God knows what kind of tree you are. He knows what kind of fruit that you should be producing. If you be close to him, everything you build will be filled with that fruit. And that's really what we should be focusing on. If you get God involved in everything you are building, as we read in the Psalms, it says, unless the Lord builds a house, the builders labor in vain. If you're not getting God involved, you're building in vain. That cornerstone verse that we were looking at a second ago is also quoted in 1 Peter chapter 2, which leads into it with the following verse. It says, as you come to him, the living stone, rejected by men, but chosen and precious in God's sight, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So forget for a moment what you're building for yourself or what you're building for God. The real question is, are you letting God build you? Way back at the start of this talk, I mentioned some very specific instructions that God gave to the Israelites during their Exodus. During the Exodus. And some of those instructions regarded building the high priest's clothes that I mentioned. And that reminded us of how God covered our sin and our shame. Well, one of the priestly clothes that is mentioned in Exodus is a vest with 12 stones on it. And we're reminded of that vest with 12 stones in John's description of the New Jerusalem in Revelation. He says, the wall was made of jasper and the city itself pure gold, as pure as glass. The foundations of the city walls were adorned with every kind of precious stone. That's Revelation 21:18. So that New Jerusalem had walls. And that's a little odd, because way back at the start again, with the story of Cain, I said walls were bad. Walls keep people out. But these walls, these are not like Cain's walls. These walls have 12 gates. That's a lot of gates for a city wall. And those gates that we're told in Revelation are always open. They're always available for people to come in. And those gates, and these walls have foundation of precious stone. These walls shine. They welcome people in. This is kind of exactly the opposite of the original walls that we started with. This new wall, it surrounds a city where everybody is a priest. Everybody has priestly access to God, where everybody has been built into this royal priesthood that we just read about. You see, God is capable of taking our mistakes, things like Cain's wall that he never intended, and turning it into something wonderful. I really like the way that Tim Mackey from the Bible Project phrases this when he talks about it. He says, God incorporates the pain and the tragedy of the human story, and he heals it. He's able to take things like walls and make them a marvelous thing for his glory. We're going to finish today by reading and meditating on Psalm 118 together. And I'm going to invite Isabel up to lead us in that. And as we meditate on this psalm together, I'd like you to choose how you're going to let God build you this week. Maybe you can invite him to heal walls that you have built. Maybe you can decide to spend more time with him this week, working at building up your relationship with him. Or maybe you can get him to teach you and learn how to build up the people around you. I'd really like you to choose something. And one thing I really and strongly encourage you to do after the service is come down and seek prayer. And you can be part of building up a culture of prayer in our service. There'll be prayer available down the right, my right, your left, at the end of the service. And I really encourage you to build up the church that way by seeking prayer. Get God involved in your plans, because that's where he wants to be.